Okay, so welcome to our very first CJS lecture for winter 2023. Welcome back. I hope you're enjoying the warmer weather that we're having right now. My name is Emma Cook, and I'm this year's Toyota visiting professor, and have been very grateful about the wonderful time I've been sharing with many of you here, so thank you. Before we get started today, I just wanted to make a couple of general announcements. First, please join us next week on Thursday, January 19th, 2023, for the second lecture of the Winter 2023 CJS lecture series, and that's titled Reading the Air and Creating Trouble, Food Allergy Disclosures in Japan, by me. Feel free to not come, that's fine. Tonight, January 12th, there will be the fifth entry in the Diamonds by the Decade, the Best of CJS 75th Anniversary Film Series, a screening of the 1970s film House, directed by Nobuhiko Obayashi. It will be shown at the State Theatre in Theatre 1 at 7:15 p.m. More information and tickets are available from the Michigan Theatre website, and apparently it's a pretty weird and wonderful film, so if you're interested, please check it out. For those attendees today joining the webinar, webcams and microphones have been muted, but we invite you to use the question and answer, or the Q&A function, during the lecture to submit any questions that you might have, and we will, of course, try to address as many of those as possible. The live transcription or the closed caption will be enabled, but if you would rather not have it, just go to the bottom right corner of your screen and you can disable it yourself. Please check out our CJS events page and the various social media for CJS lectures scheduled in the upcoming semester as well. I think we've got a great semester kicking off. So with that, I'm very happy to welcome Kate Goldfarb to the Noon Lecture Series. She is an assistant professor in anthropology at the University of Colorado, Boulder, and her research focuses, in her words, because she can explain it better than me, and I quote, on the ways social relationships impact embodied experience, intersections between public policy and well-being, and the co-production of scientific knowledge and subjective experiences, including narrative creation, end quote. Her first book project, which I'm really excited to read once it's out, is titled Fragile Kinships, Child Welfare and Well-being in Japan, and is currently under review. In the book, she explores how social inclusion and exclusion shape well-being, looking specifically at the child welfare system in Japan, and she analyzes how ideologies of kinship are implicated in discourses of cultural and national identity, as well as concepts of what constitutes normalcy. Her work speaks to and across medical anthropology, theories of kinship, feminist studies of science, and queer theory. She has also begun a new and really exciting project titled Knowing Air, in which she's working collaboratively with colleagues in disciplines such as law, mechanical engineering, and anthropology, as well as with industry, community organizations, and city government to ethnographically explore, and again in her words, the creation of and engagement with atmospheric data as a social field. So super exciting stuff to come. She's published numerous articles and chapters in journals such as American Ethnologist, Social Science and Medicine, and Japanese Studies, and I really urge all interested readers to check out her writings. They are really great. Okay, so today she will be giving us a talk titled Producing People Who Have No One, Child Welfare and Well-being in Japan, and with that, I turn the floor over to you.
Thank you so much. All right, it is so lovely to be here. Am I mic'd appropriately? Good? All right. And thank you so much for such a lovely introduction and for the invitation. And thank you all for taking your time this morning to be here. So, all right, well, with that, I will get started, I guess. Oh, thank you. Okay. All right, so this talk is called Producing People Who Have No One, Child Welfare and Well-being in Japan. Child welfare and well-being are fragile kin to each other. Such is the case in Japan, where my ethnography is based, but also across the world, as policymakers, caregivers, and people with experience in state care endeavor to imagine and implement child welfare systems that support the well-being of those imbricated in them. Yet despite these efforts, social welfare systems too often produce people who have no one. This presentation introduces my book project, Fragile Kinship, Child Welfare and Well-being in Japan, and all personal and place names are pseudonyms unless otherwise noted. The ethnographic work for this project has spanned 12 years of research in Japan and with international child welfare activists. My argument that Japan's child welfare system produces people without people is inspired by the words of one of my research interlocutors, a good friend now for over 10 years, whose story closes this presentation. This framework centers relationality in our understanding of social forms of care. In so doing, what insights might we gain about embodied and socio-emotional well-being? This presentation will introduce you to the ways that institutional and foster caregivers theorize children's relationships as a central factor in their lived experiences, and closes with a first-person account of the way it feels to be cared for in a system that overwhelmingly produces people who have no one. People without people. In the wake of Japan's entry into the United Nations Convention on the Rights of the Child in 1994, the country has been continually criticized by the UN, and more recently by Human Rights Watch, for a prioritization of institutional care rather than family-based foster care or adoption. At the time of this writing, the Japanese government has made a commitment to increase family foster care placements for preschool-age children to 75% by year 2024. And as of 2020, the national rate was about 25%. So there's still a long way to go for the government to meet its own goals. Current overall foster care rates average around 22%, 10% on the low end, and 58% at the high end, depending on the prefecture. Last year, the Ministry of Health, Labor, and Welfare reported the total number of children in state care of 42,000, including 2,400 children in institutions for infants and babies called Nyujin, 23,000 children in child welfare institutions, Jido Yogo Shisetsu, 6,000 in foster care, and 1,600 in family homes, which are group homes run by foster parents and a staff member. Despite child welfare placements being ostensibly temporary, the average placement is almost 5 years, and around 5% of children in the system live in institutional care for over 12 years. When I began this research in 2008, the current commitment to family-based care seemed unimaginable. The government's rhetoric and policy persistently focused on the lack of foster families and a perceived cultural prioritization on blood ties that would, so I was told over and over, prohibit the development of a family-based child welfare system. Thus, over the span of my research, I've seen a sea change in governmental approaches to welfare and vastly increased public interest in foster care and adoption. While my own research in both institutional settings and with foster and adoptive families supports the view that family-based care is overall beneficial to children, my research beyond Japan with international child welfare activists has highlighted a persistent problem in child welfare systems across the world, including ones that do heavily use family-based care like the US and Canada. This problem plays out in specific ways in specific places, but yields disturbingly consistent results. Welfare systems are not good at nurturing relationships for the people who need them the most. Children in state care, even in family foster care, too often age out without social supports, still suffering from the trauma caused by previous relationships and experiences of loss and violence. Erwin Ellman, the former provincial advocate for child welfare in Ontario, has taken as his clarion call the statement, "We cannot legislate love, but we can legislate the conditions in which love can flourish." Along these lines, my work centers questions of relationships as a key factor in theorizing holistic well-being. Chestnut House is a child welfare institution, a children's home or an orphanage in a suburban neighborhood outside of Tokyo. When it opened in 2009 in a welfare context where institutional care, even for infants, was still taken for granted as normative and necessary, the institution was part of a movement to create household-like child welfare institutions, kateiteki. Staff trainings took place throughout 2008, and children began moving in the summer of 2009. I was in Japan in 2008 with Professor Brightwell over here, studying at the Inter-University Center's Intensive Japanese Language Program, and was scheduled to begin my doctoral fieldwork in 2009. By a felicitous chain of introductions, I was invited to sit in on staff trainings, and Chestnut House became my first field site for participant observation. I was interested in the ways that national cultural kinship ideologies inform visions of the role of care in a social welfare context, and specifically at Chestnut House, how indices of family and household would be operationalized in an institutional setting. At Chestnut House, a minority of the children were true orphans people who entered the child welfare system entirely without people, who were wards of the state by virtue of total disconnection from other humans. That was the minority, very few. Most of the children nominally had kin, albeit kin who could not care for them. The few who were true orphans profoundly concerned the institutional staff. I sat in the Chestnut House library with staff member Nagai Miho, cups of chilled barley tea and my audio recorder in front of us. As we spoke, Nagai articulated her own theory of how a child's past experiences with family mapped onto that child's sense of self and security in the world. For Nagai, merely knowing one's own parents, even if they were absent or abusive, offered a degree of existential stability for children without alternative long-term caregivers. The children who had neither experience of being loved nor experience of being struck, who knew nothing of where they came from, why they even exist, evoked the terror of the unknown within one's own self. Nagai's preoccupation with knowledge of one's biological roots was replicated by diverse interlocutors throughout my fieldwork, highlighting the ways that social valuation of blood ties itself produces a context in which people disconnected from bloodkin are understood as uniquely and profoundly lacking. As I show in this presentation, however, it's not only children without biological kin who emerge as lacking other people. Indeed, the ostensible presence of biological kin in a child's life is one factor that makes it more difficult in a Japanese child welfare context to produce alternative kinship networks for that child. This irony suffuses the poignancy with which the staff themselves understood the situations of the children in their care. There were only 2 children at Chestnut House whose parents were both entirely absent, Nagai told me. I knew one of these children well. Eri-chan was one of the first children to move into the newly constructed institution in 2009 when she was in the 2nd grade of elementary school. She'd been removed from the care of her grandmother, who was rapidly declining from Alzheimer's. Eri had been seriously neglected, and her grandmother was emotionally abusive. Eri had told a staff member that her grandmother had told her that her mother had tossed her into a garbage bin when she was a baby. An injurious chain of secondhand half-knowledge to which the staff member had been unable to respond. It was actually due to Eri that I, a white American anthropologist, was allowed to focus my research on the house where Eri lived. Chestnut House was divided into 5 houses of 6 children and 3 staff members each. Despite the views of the Chestnut House director about the importance of developing community ties for the children, the staff hoped to mimic a normative contemporary household in the context of this institution, with typically Japanese boundaries between inside and outside, by definition excluding those without an institutional affiliation. However, the head caregiver in Eri's house felt that any social connection for Eri were better than none, hence her welcoming me, the foreign anthropologist. Eri's radical disconnection from caring others was a central condition of possibility for my own research. It wasn't Eri who Nagai wanted to discuss. There's one child, a 6-year-old, Nagai told me. The first time I met him, he said, "I might as well be dead. It doesn't matter. Boku nanka shindatte inda." Somehow I knew. Yusuke-kun? Yes, yes. My own prescience had startled me. I hadn't previously known anything about this child's background. He said it would be better if you were dead. You know, there's a road right out front, and the cars come fast around the bend. It was right after I started working here. That child, he's the kind of child who comes right up close, but how do you describe it? He's also like ungrounded, fura-fura. Like sometimes I feel he's really fond of me, other times I don't. Sometimes he's attached to my hip, other times he doesn't come near me. Nagai had been next to the road with Yusuke, who made to run into the street. She called out for him to hold her hand and attempted to stop him, and that was when he said it. "I might as well be dead. It doesn't matter." These words seemed seared into Nagai's memory. She had stuttered a response. "If you weren't here, I would be sad," and the exchange ended. But she told me, "He says things like that. It would be just as well if I were dead. I might as well be dead." For a 6-year-old to say that? It was painful for me. Like, what can I do? Nagai laughed shortly. I feel like crying. She wiped her eyes. Other staff members had also reported that Yusuke said these sorts of things. I may be overthinking, but it feels like in these instances, a foundational lack of security rises to the surface. How did I know that it was Yusuke, out of all the other little boys in the institution who said he might as well be dead? We returned to this question later in the conversation. He'd always seemed untethered to me, as though he were floating along the surface of interactions, but also uncannily observant. He remembered every adult's name, including mine. He had wide, round eyes that sometimes sparkled with intelligence and sometimes seemed odd and vacant. Yusuke untethered above to parents or ancestors, untethered laterally to siblings or caregivers who felt deeply for him. His path had taken him through an institution for infants, where he apparently had had a caregiver who was very fond of him. But he had been separated from her, moved to Chestnut House because he was too old to stay in the baby home. He was a person without other people to root him to this earth. Producing relationlessness. Some children, like Eri and Yusuke, enter the child welfare system without anyone. In a country like Japan, where family affiliation takes precedence in ensuring a person's social legibility, the figure of a child disconnected, like a free-floating signifier, is hauntingly evocative. For Nagai Miho, it was better to have an abusive parent than no parent at all. But I learned over the course of my research that the mere existence of biological kin, specifically a parent who had not explicitly relinquished custody, was the most powerful reason why a child would not be placed in a foster family or given opportunities to develop lasting relationships with alternative caregivers. People connected to the child welfare system all work to theorize relationships and enable those they view as beneficial. Perspectives surrounding kinship, relationality, and belonging thus orient the pragmatic actions of policymakers, child welfare caseworkers, institutional directors, foster and institutional care workers, and the children and youth within the system. Overall, the Japanese child welfare system is oriented to the goal of keeping children connected to their biological parents, if only through maintaining a legal relationship. In most cases, parents have the right to determine their child's residence, and caseworkers negotiate with parents to place the child in out-of-home care, either because parents explicitly oppose family foster care or adoption, or because caseworkers anticipate that they will. Caseworkers are highly motivated to place children in institutional care. In large part because child welfare placements average many years in Japan, it's widely understood that family foster care, like adoption, has the potential to produce durable affective bonds between the child and caregivers. And those bonds are believed to threaten any continued connection between the child and biological parents. Michael Rivera King has called the cultural belief that a child can belong to only one family, the single family bond. Child welfare placement officers are thus tasked with determining which relationships should be prioritized in what they perceive to be a zero-sum game, where the very people they're negotiating with, the child's parents, could easily be the losers. By placing a child in an institution, a professionalized workspace, where staff turnover is generally high, the child will likely not develop affective bonds to caregivers that would compete with the child's potential connection to biological kin, as attenuated or non-existent as these connections may be. While these placements are often framed as temporary, individual institutional care placements may be many years. The child welfare treatise, Children Who Wait, describes the ways children in state care exist in an unending state of anticipation, waiting for decisive action from adults that never materializes. In Japan, children may be understood as waiting for engagement from parents who they might not even know. If placement in an institution does not cut the parent-child bond, it's precisely because parents may figure the institution as an open-ended space for waiting. As one institutional staff member told me, we're not raising these children. We're temporarily entrusted with their care, azukatemasu. Even caseworkers have short-term relationships with children, as the majority of child welfare officers in Japan are government workers who are transferred to different divisions every 3 to 5 years. Thus, from all sides, children in Japanese institutions are engaging with parents, caseworkers, and caregivers as adults who are temporarily invested in their well-being, with an ever-receding horizon at which temporary engagements might transform into something more durable. Thus, the irony, institutional staff members are uniquely preoccupied by children who have no kin at all. But those are the children who are more likely to be placed in a context where they can develop substitute kinship relationships. The children with family, on the other hand, are more likely to grow up in an institution without a lasting relationship with any caregiver, nor a substantive or positive relationship to the biological kin who could not care for them to begin with. This is a problem that Chestnut House staff members were acutely aware of, even as I watched one after another staff member make the difficult decision to quit working at the institution, cutting ties with the children for whom they had often come to care deeply. As of 2020, there are only 2 staff members at the institution who'd been there since its opening in 2009. The majority of the children, however, still lived there. In the remainder of this presentation, I offer 2 case studies to respond to my core research question. By centering relationality in our understanding of welfare, what insights might we gain about bodily life and socio-emotional well-being? The first case study is presented from the perspective of foster parent caregivers, and the second is the perspective of a man who was raised for 15 years in institutional care. She grew up for us. I was at a restaurant with Masa and a few other friends. After a couple rounds of beer, conversation turned to Noriko, who was then in high school. Noriko had been living with Masa and his wife Rie for 18 months as a foster child. She'd been raised by her mother and had been neglected for most of her life. She'd never been placed in alternative care before now. The first month Noriko spent in their home, she was a stone, Masa told us. We asked Noriko to tell us when she liked things or didn't like things, and she wouldn't respond. Masa wiped tears out of his eyes and took a sip of beer. After the first month, we sat down with her and we told her we wanted her to try harder. If you like something or don't like something, you don't need to say anything, we told her. Just nod or shake your head. Masa paused for effect, and she did. She started responding. Masa then told her that he wanted her to practice something new, expressing emotion. When she felt something, he told her, he wanted her to try to express it, and Masa said she did. In an extended interview, I asked Rie about her experiences fostering Noriko. Rie described an aggressive and impermeable affectlessness. When Noriko came, it was totally like this, she told me, sitting back with her face a blank, her eyes slightly unfocused. Totally no smile or anything. Even if you addressed her directly, Nori-chan, she wouldn't respond. Then if you asked her, would you reply? She would say, oh, what is it? Nan desu ka? She would cry really easily, get mad really easily. She would injure herself. Rie mimicked scratching her wrists and show it to you. At first it was really, really hard, but now she's okay. It's okay. Rie had earlier told me that slowly but surely the atmosphere of the house had become comfortable. We can finally talk now. Rie described the changes that Noriko underwent in the months since she had arrived at their house. When Noriko first came, her clothes were unstylish and frumpy, dasai, and she started asking Rie to take her shopping. Rie realized that Noriko had been intently watching her put on makeup and would imitate her. She's really, really mature, Rie said. Then, as though remembering something crucial, Rie leaned toward me. It was incredible. Suddenly she grew up. Kyuni seichou shita. In an intense whisper, she said, her teeth came in. What? Still whispering, Rie explained. Until last year, her period was also irregular, but now it started coming regularly, and her teeth came in. She still had 5 of her baby teeth. They started to get wiggly all of a sudden, and I figured they were cavities. You've got cavities, I told her, and she said, I don't ever remember losing them when I was a kid. Masa and I were like, no way, you're kidding, and we took her to a dentist. They took an x-ray, and lo and behold, her baby teeth were still there, and from behind, her grown-up teeth were coming out all of a sudden. That is so strange. It's totally strange. Around the time when her teeth started wiggling, her period became regular, and suddenly Rie put her hands over her own breasts and indicated them becoming larger. And her frame of mind, kimochi, became totally adult. She became an adult. It was just when I thought this girl has really grown up when her teeth started to wiggle. In the end, 2 baby teeth are still left, but the others all came out. One by one, the adult teeth suddenly came in. She got adult teeth. The dentist was so shocked. Later, I commented that Noriko's sudden development might be connected to the good environment that Rie and Masa created for her in their home. Yeah, Rie replied. She grew up for us. In Japanese, Rie said that Noriko seichou shite kureta, which can be translated as Noriko's growing up was done for Rie and Masa, or Rie and Masa benefited from the favor of Noriko's growing up. Rie's description contains an important element of reciprocity. In response to something done for her by Rie and Masa, Noriko returned the favor by growing up. Many months after this initial interview, I raised the topic of Noriko's physical transformations, again with Rie. She understood Noriko's growing up as a material expression of her feelings of safety and security, anzen, anshin, in her foster home. Before she came to their home, Rie told me, Noriko clearly had not been ready to be an adult. But in the time she spent with them, she finally became emotionally ready, and her body followed suit. Well, Rie said with a laugh, you can't see a person's spirit, can you? kokoro wa mienai yo ne. In Rie's understanding, the body makes visible and material the status of the spirit, mind, or heart, which otherwise only becomes haltingly knowable as communication skills develop. Rie also made clear that the relationship with Noriko was still sometimes difficult. Although they intended to always be available to Noriko, it wasn't as though their relationship was idyllic or particularly profound. It was just the ordinariness of a stable life and stable supportive relationships that provided the space for Noriko's development. Rie did not belabor the significance of Noriko's bodily transformations. As surprising as they were, it seemed clear to Rie that Noriko's body and spirit together expressed the emergent relationships in their home and exemplified the surprising and hopeful capacities of caregiving and receiving. Embedded bodies. My research shows in multifarious ways that social relationships are experienced and expressed in the body, which is constantly open to new environmental and social stimuli. Although some might assume that the human body is always animated by internal progressions of growth that fluctuate little across cultures and across populations, many of the foster and institutional caregivers I knew in Japan had experiences like those of Rie and Masa that threw into relief the fact that normal development is not always a useful heuristic. These findings recall Margaret Locke's theory of local biologies, in which biological processes are, quote, products of an ongoing dialectic between biology and culture, in which both are contingent. Locke and Nguyen call this process biosocial differentiation, a concept used, quote, to refer to the continual interactions of biological and social processes across time and space that eventually sediment into local biologies. The concept of local biologies helps explain diverse phenomena. For instance, epidemiological studies correlating the experience of racism with the birth of low birth weight infants is a classic example of, in the words of Nancy Krieger, quote, how people as both biological organisms and social beings literally embody the dynamic, social, material, and ecological contexts into which we are born, develop, interact, and endeavor to lead meaningful lives. The lines between biological and social factors are ever blurry. In Japan, attention to the ways people use their bodies, specifically actions related to eating, offered many of my interlocutors clues about the backgrounds of children in their care. The way a person holds chopsticks in Japan is sometimes understood as an index of personal histories of care and neglect. And one caseworker told me that people who held their chopsticks improperly, in the shape of an X or in a fist, indicated that they had not been carefully raised, and they might have family problems. Adult research contacts who had spent time in child welfare institutions sometimes commented on their own improper way of holding chopsticks, bemoaning the fact that they'd never been taught to use them properly. A Chestnut House staff member once mentioned to me that there are a disproportionate number of children in Japanese child welfare institutions who are left-handed because no caregiver intervened to teach them to use their right hand. They remained instead as they were when they were born, umareta mama. Finally, the children who arrived at Chestnut House directly from baby homes sometimes did not know how to chew. Baby homes care for both infants and toddlers, and most of these institutions provide the same food for all children who are no longer drinking formula, rice gruel and very soft pastas and vegetables. According to staff members, the children did not develop jaw strength or the ability to chew and swallow harder foods. Those critical of institutions for infants point out that the failure to meet this developmental milestone indicates signs of developmental delay caused by insufficient stimulation inherent in institutional care of infants. In this sense, staff members understood that biological capacities opaquely indicated the possibility for neurobiological developmental shifts and were perceived as abnormal and potentially long-lasting. For my interlocutors, embodied habits traced out histories of care and its normative underpinnings. Lack of caring engagement left embodied traces, and the Chestnut House staff members read these as signs of past relationships. We see that children's bodies are, quote, embedded bodies, in Georg Neuener's turn of phrase. An embedded body, Neuener wrote, is heavily impregnated by its own past and by the social and material environment within which it dwells. It is a body that is imprinted by evolutionary and transgenerational time, by early life, and a body that is highly susceptible to changes in its social and material environment, end quote. Interpersonal histories perdure in these embedded bodies, producing, quote, somatic memory effects that remind both caregivers and children of these pasts. The experiences of caregivers and children receiving care within the Japanese child welfare system, belie the stability of the concept of standard child development across populations, and draw into relief the diversity of the ways biological processes occur, signify, and are experienced, all within specific relational contexts. The space the parent should have filled. I close this presentation with one person's subjective exploration of the ways he perceived the absence of kinship ties as an embodied presence. Hanashima Shinichi had lived his entire infancy and childhood in Japanese child welfare institutions. He'd never been raised by his parents, and he'd experienced sexual and physical abuse in the child welfare institution where he grew up. Although his current life was successful and rich by most measures, with a stable job, a companionate marriage, one biological child, and one foster child, his experiences in state care continued to indelibly mark his life, and he still sometimes experienced traumatic flashbacks. He worked tirelessly to campaign for the placement of infants in foster and adoptive homes rather than in institutions, and he was deeply involved with an organization whose goal was to eliminate abuse within child welfare institutions. Hanashima's own embodied sensibility hews quite closely to attachment theorists whom he has read. In one conversation, he referenced Mary Ainsworth's canonical experiments, the strange situation procedure. The strange situation experiments were designed to evaluate a child's attachment type by examining the child's proximity-seeking behavior to the parent after the parent leaves the child alone or with a stranger and then later returns. Ainsworth's research was based on John Bowlby's attachment theory, the notion that key relationships with important caregivers shape the child's self-image, which will in turn shape the child's expectations for relationships with other people. Bowlby developed the concept of the secure base, in which, in its ideal typical form, an infant is able to check in with the parent while exploring new surroundings. If a parent leaves the room, Hanashima said, the securely attached child will cry, right? When I thought about these strange situation studies, I thought, what about myself? Do I have an internalized parent? Hanashima seemed to be wondering whether he himself had a secure base. But it wasn't just himself he was thinking about. He was also considering his foster child who had been identified as attachment disordered. He explained that his idea of the internalized parent also meant a person's awareness and memory of the parent's way of thinking, the things the parent said, and parental discipline. If the parent has been internalized, Hanashima posited, this internalized parent should exist within the child, over a child's whole life, and would act as the child's moral compass. He argued that he himself had no internalized moral compass. It was simply logic that told him if he did something bad, he would lose his job. His voice catching, Hanashima explained, I've always, to put it frankly, it's like I've always had this feeling of a hole open in my chest. Mune ni ana ga aiteru. It's anguishing. Probably by all rights, there has always been this place left open in my heart for the parent who should have filled that space. Watashi no kokoro no naka ni hairu beki oya. A parent or someone who would have raised me. But I've lived this entire time without someone filling that space. Hanashima said he'd read accounts of institutional care and foster families from other countries, and he noticed that the expression, a hole in the heart, appeared often. I've had that feeling my entire life, he told me. That sounds like it hurts. It does, it hurts so much. There are times when it physically hurts, he replied. Hanashima hypothesized that his own Christianity, he was raised in a Catholic institution, might have filled some of the space long left open. Motivated by both his own embodied sense of lack and by his reading of child development literature, Hanashima had developed a firm model for child welfare. For him, it boiled down to not creating people who have no one. Daremo inai hito o tsukuranai. His personal goal to place infants and very young children in family-based settings rather than institutions was a wide-reaching goal to place a parent figure inside each child. This parent would live inside the child's heart. Sono kodomo no kokoro ni sumu. Hanashima pointed out that in his own activities, he never wavers. He insists without exception that babies should be placed in households, not institutions. It's because for me, inside me, I understand the cause of my own suffering, the cause of my own difficulty in living, ikizurasa. Hanashima is one of the most fervent child welfare reform activists I've encountered, and his singularity of focus and conviction impresses even those who disagree with him. Even as Hanashima makes use of attachment theory, trauma theory, and neuroscience in his appeals to Japan's Ministry of Child Welfare and Labor and Welfare, I find Hanashima's most compelling evidence to rest on his personal and highly visceral experiences of lack. In one interview, Hanashima described his first visit to an institutional baby home in Japan. The cribs like small cages or pens lined up one after another with solitary babies lying behind tall railings in each one. When I saw those, it was agonizing. Those babies had been abandoned, thrown away, and I saw that my former self, of course I have no memory of that time, but as one would expect, there were no adults there, just children are lined up alone. And I saw them, and it was myself too. It somehow overlapped. It was agony. I felt I had to somehow help these children, but it was also connected to the need to help my former self. Hanashima said that despite recurrent flashbacks from which he still suffers, he's mostly managed to process his experiences of abuse in the institution where he grew up. Those memories, he said, are now sepia-colored, and while scars remain, they're old scars. But the one topic that remains an ever-present source of suffering, a topic he speculates he will be forced to deal with for his entire life, is the fact that as a child he always had been alone. There was never anyone there for him. Daremo inakatta. At the same time, it's Hanashima's sense of internal emptiness that provides him energy for his activist work. And indeed, in a 2019 conversation, Hanashima emphasized that he did not want me to understand his experiences of suffering as a weakness or lasting sorrow. Rather, his stories of suffering are his fighting story, the source of his strength. He had always enjoyed physics, and if he had had the financial resources to go to university, that is what he would have studied. He said, "It's like the physics concept of the Dirac sea, the idea of limitless energy that is also a space of nothingness. Within myself, from that space of total nothingness, from that completely empty part, that's where I draw energy to continue my activism." In the process, he said, and despite the long perception of himself acting totally alone, he's also discovered that he's surrounded by people who support him. Hanashima's embodied sensibilities are exquisitely attuned to relationality, and particularly to the absence that he experiences as a productive but painful presence. Conclusion. My interlocutors often use two words to describe their goals for children in the child welfare system, anzen and anshin. These terms, safe and secure, share the character for ease. On the one hand, being safe and secure seems like a rather minimal goal and could be interpreted as pointing to a sort of Agamben-style support for bare life with the provision of clothing, food, and housing, ishokuju. But taking these terms' most expansive meaning, they direct us to the definition of well-being that has informed my analysis. Ease in life is cultivated holistically through a sense of wellness in one's emotional, physical, and social dimensions of experience. Echoing international child welfare norms, Japanese child welfare discourse has recently taken up the concept of permanency in articulating goals for state wards. Although often written katakana as permanency, one Japanese translation of this term is poignant, eizokuteki shinrai kankei, a persistent or lasting relationship of trust, and points to the stability and ease of a relationship in which one can believe. Feeling safe and secure in the world means feeling rooted, tethered in some way, knowing that there are people out there for whom your existence matters. Safety and security emerge through positive, supportive relationships, and it is through theorizing welfare and well-being as a consequence of relationships that, I've shown, offers a powerful window into socio-emotional and bodily life, in a context where relationships themselves are too often attenuated and fragile. When I most recently visited Chestnut House, I asked after Yusuke-kun, the boy without kin, who said he might as well be dead. A staff member told me he was actually doing better. He seemed more stable. It turned out that they had discovered that Yusuke had an uncle, maybe in Saitama. There had been no contact with the uncle, but just knowing that he was not entirely alone in the world, the staff member told me, seemed to help. Eri-chan was one of the 2 children in the institution who'd been successfully placed in family foster care. She'd had a weekend foster parent for a few years, but she repeatedly had said she did not wish to live with this foster mother full-time. My own interpretation of Eri's resistance was that she was close to many of the staff members at Chestnut House, but over time, one after another quit their jobs, while Eri remained. In a 2018 visit to Japan, I learned over dinner with some of the staff that with help from her caseworker at the Child Guidance Center, Eri had managed to piece together details about her early life, and she decided to look for her father. When the caseworker finally located him, he said he had no interest in seeing Eri. At that point, and precisely because she had no kin staking a claim to her, she determined on her own terms that she wanted to leave Chestnut House to live full-time in foster care. Eri's lack of kin became the condition for new relationships. It is the children who still live at Chestnut House, or who have aged out or left under circumstances not of their choosing, all of whom ostensibly have kin, who preoccupy me the most. Kinship ties, whether positive or negative, develop over time, and child welfare policy and practice should cultivate rather than preclude the possibilities of long-term relationships between children and caregivers. Attention both to the contingency of kinship ties and the possibilities for creating new connections should inform the ways we imagine and then implement child welfare frameworks that nurture the development of diverse relational bonds. I hope that my work opens up space for appreciating the creative and imaginative work of building caregiving ties in and out of kinship constraints, but that it also illuminates the existential stakes of diverse welfare systems orientations toward cultivating relationality. Relationships can injure and harm, but they can also transform. What are the conditions for our welfare system that nurtures well-being, that produces people who have people? And that is the end. Thank you for listening. The talk is so intense, eh? I was like, this is kind of a downer, I bet. I'm glad to take people's questions. And I'll say this picture here is the Iken box that's required to be in child welfare institutions, so kids can ostensibly enter their opinions anonymously into this little box here. So I'd like to hear your go Iken as well.
Great. So we don't have any questions online yet, but we do have questions in the room. So Reggie, please go for it.
That's right. Thank you so much, Professor Goldfarb, for that really interesting talk. So I was really struck by a couple of things in your talk. One of them was, I forget his name, but the activist has the hole in his heart and is kind of performing a certain type of his fight, a kind of masculinity in this context, and is really identifying with what he's projecting onto some of the kids. So I was wondering a little bit about effectively kind of ethnographic description of some of the workers in these contexts. I mean, partially because you mentioned at the end that they're resigning, and I'm just wondering about kind of demographically, for instance, what's going on with the aging populations. I'm thinking about kind of immigrants, or kind of particularly like, say, Filipina workers who might be kind of in that kind of industry in relation to the kinds of, like, what makes an ideal worker in this kind of space according to some of the institutions themselves, particularly as it relates to race, ethnicity, and kind of class background, because I'm just wondering about this implied institutional kind of family dynamic and what kind of prerequisites or kind of expectations or mandates, explicit or implicit, are kind of operative there. If you could talk a little bit about that.
Yeah, really interesting. Right. Well, so a couple things to say. I mean, the sort of family style thing, I will tell you all, has died a violent death at this institution. And it was kind of a violent death. So the way that it was created was under the auspices of creating a family-like institution. And so as you're commenting on, right, there would be sort of like ideologies about who properly might constitute that family. And over time, that was seen as incredibly idealistic by the director who started the institution. And what they found out was that if you put children of all different ages together in spaces where they're not highly supervised, and you create this family-like institution, children do all sorts of things to each other. And so they actually are completely reformulating restructuring the institution from the ground up. They're rebuilding it so that rooms are separated, girls and boys are separated by age. And so the family-like thing has become defunct. So that's just something to say, sort of out of context. The institutional caregivers that I met, sort of just like demographically, a lot of them themselves had experience in child welfare. And I didn't meet people who identified as non-ethnically Japanese in that context, but that, of course, isn't representative just at this particular institution. These folks, the caregivers, I think, were all ethnically Japanese. The kids weren't. Some of them were biracial, or especially in the areas near bases, as one might imagine, there's a lot of biracial kids. So, in terms of what people would think an ideal caregiver would be, Well, the pro caregivers had been there for 3 years. So that's what, this is a high turnover job. Like it's one that's really stressful, and just being in these spaces, there's just so much sort of like energy. If you really love kids, maybe it's okay. I like kids quite a lot, but I found it just absolutely exhausting. So the folks that could stick it out were considered ideal in some ways. A lot of those people were people who didn't have their own families. So were like single, unmarried, or were much older. But the folks that I saw quitting were folks who just found it too difficult to continue this like emotionally draining work, especially if they had other kind of family commitments that pulled on them. So yeah, I mean, I don't know how good of an answer that is, but that was my observation in this particular context. It's a hard job.
We do have one question come in from online, so if you're okay, we'll just take that one and then we'll come straight to you. So John Campbell online, it's more of a comment, but says it's interesting that Anzen Anshin is often seen as the key element in old age care in Japan. So just building on that, could you maybe speak a little bit about the discourse in vis-a-vis in the childcare sector as well?
Yeah, I didn't, to be honest, I didn't hear people talking about elder care as like a counterpoint. I mean, I think that, and I've gotten that question from other people about my research too, because I think there seem to be clear parallels in terms of isolation and connectedness and ideas of community and things like that. So I guess my only answer is I suppose it's a little weird that I didn't hear a lot of parallels drawn to that. And I think as Professor Jackson's point speaks to also, the caregivers I think there probably are more immigrant caregivers too in the elder care context for whatever reason. I'm not sure, it may be a sort of certification issue, but anyhow. So I think that's a really interesting point though, right? The sort of baseline notions of safety and security as something that maybe could be aspired to in either context, right? Yeah, thank you for the question.
Thank you so much, Professor, for your discussion. It was really fascinating, all of the ethnographic detail, and to hear these stories. I was especially struck by Eddie's story and the statement that you made at the end, that once she actually did find her parental figure who didn't actually want her, that cleared the way psychologically for her to want to leave the institution and enter like foster care. And it made me think about the adoption process in Japan, the formal adoption process, and how the obstacle of having parents who still retain certain kinds of rights continues to kind of be an issue. And I guess one question I had in relation to that is, how does that hold of rights by kin in Japan compare to other countries, for example, like the United States? I was wondering if there's any movement to relax some of those kinds of kin ties or holds, I guess you could say. And then I guess the other question I have is in terms of foster parents, in terms of the system of foster care, whether there are similar kinds of financial incentives to be foster parents, whether there's training, and what that system looks like in terms of foster care outside of the institutional context.
Okay, help me make sure that I address all of your questions.
Sorry about that.
No, that's great. So from last to first maybe, the financial benefits are like the foster parents that I know are in debt basically in Japan. So I think in the United States there's much more sort of notion that this is something that could actually pay for one's own, as a foster family, one's sort of baseline expenses, whether or not that's considered a very good rate. But the foster families I know in Japan, I mean there's this notion of course that affective labor shouldn't be like monetarily motivated, economically motivated, right? So, but in reality people are really in debt by having foster kids. So there's that, and Professor Alexi might know more about some of these questions than I do at the moment, actually, about parental rights. But there is this desire to make adoption easier. So there was a reform to the adoption law, I think in 2019, am I right? Probably, that was dedicated to making it easier to do the type of adoption where you actually do separate the parental rights from the child. My understanding is the family courts, though, are still very, very biased towards biological kin, for better or for worse. So if you have a case where a child has to go to family court to have adjudicated whether they're removed from the parental, the koseki, it's just uncommon that it would be sort of forcibly terminated. And in the United States, that's a really different situation. So parents, depending on state, it's different, but biological parents, if they don't show up, if they don't do X, Y, Z, it's fairly common to have parental rights terminated. And in Japan, you can have parents that are, as they say, yukue fume, like completely, destination unknown for a very, very long period of time, but that doesn't constitute a reason to actually terminate parental rights. So it's a pretty different framework, and as you say, it's difficult in many ways. Were there other questions that you had that I haven't addressed?
No, that's really good. Thank you so much.
Okay, thanks. Do you have anything to add? I don't.
No, I'm still formulating a question.
Okay.
I was thinking along the same lines, so yeah. Okay, I have a half-baked question.
Sorry, I didn't mean to put you on the spot.
Unless, Emma, is there somebody on queue?
There is not anybody
Okay.
currently
Sure.
online. Yeah.
Ryan, thank you so much for that. So here's my half-baked thought. I was thinking about, I don't quite have the vocabulary for it yet, but I was thinking about the sort of ideology behind the way that we think about kinship and sort of slotting people in and slotting people out. And like, as you just said, it feels like, and this sounds so sort of derogatory, so that's why I'm not happy with this language, but it feels like in the US there's a more, at least in theory, there's a more kind of expansive understanding of how many connections or relationships or kin anybody could have.
Mm-hmm.
And it does feel like what I know about the Japanese system is it's like there's a finite number of slots, and it's either 2 or 3. Like it's not at most. Do you know
I
what
love
I mean?
that
Like,
you have a number in mind
yeah,
too.
because
Right.
I'm thinking about people I know, right?
Mhm.
And that it's like, okay, well, to add a foster parent, it feels like Legos or something now. Do you know, like to add a foster parent, we have to remove the biological parent, and we don't want to ever remove the biological parent if there's any hope that that person could return to the child's life. So therefore, we don't want to. Does that make sense at all? So I was thinking about that, and I was thinking about why. I mean, obviously, I'm comparing the U.S. and Japan, which isn't really fair to do, and all of that too. But I was thinking about why that would be, and why we're thinking about broadly sort of those kinds of relationships in those ways, in those different ways. The other thing, the question I was actually thinking about was one that I've been getting a lot and have been trying to think about a lot, which is you said at the very beginning of your presentation that it feels like there's a bit of a sea change. And I think you were referring to the new idea in 2008 or so to have these family-based. Is that what the sea change was?
It's actually not, because that was, what I was thinking of when I said a sea change was actually just this notion that you actually could imagine placing kids in foster care in a more sort of systematic way. And I do too, I want to clarify that I'm not trying to valorize foster care as like the solution, because the United States, I know you're not saying that, but the United States is a great example of why we can't just say like this way is better. But I mean, that really is the sea change, was the sort of, I think it was 2014 was the new vision of child welfare, and that was this idea that especially babies needed to be in families. And so that sort of, it was really top down in Japan, which has not been effective. But as much policy as in Japan, it's this notion that it's like these broad guidelines that prefectures are in charge of implementing. And so the result is that it isn't happening the way that they said they wanted it to happen, but it's a sort of different rhetoric about like the feasibility, the imaginability of foster care as being and adoption as being like a way forward, which when I was doing field work starting in 2008 was just not, it was like institutions, let's make them cute kind of thing instead. Yeah.
Well, so thank you for that clarification. That's really helpful. I was thinking about the sea change because, as you might probably know, there's a lot of talk now about making joint custody legal, or possible, I should say, after divorce. So joint custody is, of course, always possible if you're married, right? The question is joint custody possible after divorce? And the Ministry of Justice has come out with a sort of recommendation. A committee has recommended that this change. It's not yet gone into effect. It's not really clear that it will, although it seems like it will, but it's not that popular. So and I was thinking, people ask me, like, what happened? Why is this happening now all of a sudden? And obviously the political motivation is one story. And I think there is a lot of pressure from like Ministry of Foreign Affairs and other countries, and you were saying like the Convention on the Rights of the Child and stuff like that as sort of international norms. But I've been thinking a lot about whether this is actually a sea change, to use your language. I mean, and what you're saying certainly is, but I was thinking about all of a sudden, and there's, I mean, nobody cares but me, but they're also changing how long women have to wait 100 days before they remarry. I mean, let's be clear, some women also care, right? It's not just me. Women have to wait to remarry, and they're shortening that or reducing that entirely. So there's all these little things that are happening, but the idea of having joint custody, because you would exist on some level in two koseki, which is also feels like that kind of slotting in and slotting out. Do you see what the connection I'm trying to make?
Yeah, 100%.
So I just wanted to hear, I mean, you already explained what sea change meant, but that's what I was thinking, like, is it a sea change? Is it the top-down model for a sea change where it's like, oh yeah, we want to change the terminology or change the policies, but God knows what's going to happen on the ground? Or is it actually reflective of some kind of ideological change, like real perspective on, oh wait, no, children actually do need a home base or someone that, you know, that kind of thing. So I'm sorry that's such a long rambly question.
No, it's awesome. I mean, it's, so, you know, you could be a sort of like, you know, institutionalist determinist, right, by saying the koseki is the reason why things are the way they are. But in some ways that's truth, right? I mean, it's, if you don't have a system in which you can register people into koseki, and the problem is the same for same-sex marriage, right? So it's like, does the koseki itself produce these contexts in which you don't have sort of the creative flexibility to imagine something different than slotting one in and slotting one out, right? I really like that phrasing because it feels that way to me too from I mean, that was very true to my own observations, what you said. You know, so I don't know about whether it's a sea change actually, like in terms of how people are thinking about the sort of capaciousness of humans to have relationships. And I guess one explanation of that wording is that, I mean, it's tough in Japan because in the United States, foster caregivers know that there's another family out there, and a lot of people understand that it's kind of their job as foster parents to cultivate those relationships between the child and the biological parents. That's kind of their child's right to have relationships with their biological parents, right? But also to be cared for in a safe context. And in Japan, in part because of the difficulty with adoption, you have all of these foster parents who register as foster parents because they would really like to adopt, but they can't because there's not children available for adoption, and that's because they haven't been relinquished. So, and they want to adopt special adoption. They don't want to have a regular adoption that keeps the child connected to the koseki of the family of origin. So in a sense, I mean, there's, you know, in this question of like what's sort of popular sentiment on these questions, from the caregivers' perspectives, a lot of them feel very threatened by biological parents. So it goes all ways, right? The biological parents probably feel threatened by foster parents. The institutional caregivers know that everybody feels threatened. The staff, the caseworkers are worried about these things too, right? So, you know, I mean, I'm not sure if there is the institutional framework on the one hand that if it were changed, there might be more possibilities, right? And maybe there's a way in which that will produce new norms and new ways of thinking about these questions. But, you know, I mean, I think the question of koseki is really important. And when you ask people in child welfare what they think about the koseki, it's interesting because there was a person I interviewed connected to, do folks know about the baby drop box in Kumamoto? So it's a place that it's like a safe haven where you can supposedly can anonymously abandon a baby. And I've done some research on this. It's not actually anonymous. They had this nurse who was chasing families. Like after she would track their cars and fly back to find them. And it was, anyway, I mean, I personally think it's a terrible system for a lot of different reasons. But the caseworker who dealt with the kids coming from the baby drop box, I interviewed her, and she was saying, you know, like a lot of people say we should just abolish the koseki because that's why a lot of people want to abandon babies anonymously. They don't want this child in their koseki for whatever reason. And she said koseki guarantees rights and responsibilities, and it is a form of safety for kids. So her entire thing is that people should not be anonymously abandoning their children. They should be relinquishing formally, giving the children information about their background, giving them the medical information that they need and all of those things above board, going through processes of relinquishment. So she really, and she never said anything about like revising the koseki as an option, but she was like really emphatic, like, abolishing the koseki is not the solution to this problem. So that was sort of interesting. And then the one other thing, sorry, I didn't get your name. Ryan, okay. I wanted to respond to one other thing you'd said about the girl Eri-chan. I remembered how you said that her knowledge sort of gave her path forward. And so another interlocutor of mine used the word akirameru, so the idea to quit is akiraka ni suru, to make clear. So to quit and to make clear are connected for her. And so this notion of information, which is connected back to the koseki, right? The more information that people have, they can make informed decisions about sort of tracking their own path forward, right? And so in Eri-chan's case, that was very much that way, right? Like she felt she knew what the domain was, so she could make decisions. And so that's one of the problems with this lack of knowledge that especially a kid abandoned in the drop box at GK Hospital knows nothing about their background, and there's this sort of like void. And so, the final thing to say is that this is the response to that void is culturally conditioned, right? There's nothing necessarily universally human about needing to know biological kin. But in Japan, that's such an important context for self, right? So it's just sort of overdetermines the fact that for a lot of people that feels existentially unsound to not know anything, right? So anyhow, that was sort of like a really wide-ranging answer.
Thank you. Thanks very much for your presentation. I have two questions. The first is, I'm not really sure whether you mentioned something about siblings, but I watched a documentary by Ashley John Baptiste recently on the BBC that's called Split Up in Care, Life Without Siblings. And I was very fascinated by it. And I wonder whether most of the children that you were approaching have any other family members that may also become supportive relationships. And the second one is about whether you use race in your research to think about, as a frame to think about the experiences of these mixed race children that you encountered in the site of your research as well, in relation to Japanese national discourses, and if you can tell us a little bit more about that. Thanks.
Great. Yes. So siblings, in some cases siblings are really like forms of strong support for these kids, but many institutions divide children into groups based on age. And so what that might mean pragmatically is that you might be in the same institution as your siblings, but you might not really know them very well. Or you kind of know, like, that's, my brother, but you don't hang out ever, right? So you don't have that sort of like relationship. And so this is really a human rights issue, one might say. And that's a point that, the UN pays attention to as well. I did know some groups of folks. So there was a kind of household that I was really close to who lived in Osaka, and it was actually two sibling pairs that lived together, and they were all in the same institution growing up. But one of the sibling pairs, there were actually 8 kids in that family, and they were all in the institution at different periods. But my friend really only knew her younger brother, who she lived with, when I knew her, like after they left the institution, and then the brother right above her. She knew him too, but the rest of them, like she kind of like understood as a relation, but kind of like shinseki, but like really far sort of kin, and didn't have a relationship with. So it's interesting because like a lot of my work doesn't deal with those sort of horizontal relationships between siblings because it was so attenuated. And in reality, kids did form social support networks like within the institution. So they would often leave, and then those are the people that they care about. And one woman recently was telling me, she was like, this entire thing about like either reunification with biological parents or like foster care, she said, yamete hoshii. I wish they would stop talking about these things. And I said, oh really, why? And she said, because it's terrifying to be in a situation where you're the only child in a household that you're in this like foster family or like your parents who maltreated you anyhow to begin with. She's like, I would much rather be in an institution where I have relationships with the people that I grew up with, right? Like these kids that are my people, you know? And so, you know, it's really hard to make sort of blanket statements about what these policies should look like. But again, like the sort of focus on durable relationships for me is kind of like whatever that looks like, those are good, right? Like any kind of relationship that lasts longer than a year means that you can actually learn to have relationships. So that's a long answer to your question. I didn't have a lot of mixed race kids in the institution where I did research. So there were only a couple. And so as a result, race is not one of my key frameworks that I'm thinking with in terms of how to understand the particular context of child welfare that I did research in. And it is important, of course, in the sense of theorizing Japanese nationality, right? Like this sort of, and what I'm really interested in is the ways that notions of kinship inform notions of nation. And so that could be speaking to race, so sort of more broadly is important, but I don't have a hugely, it just wasn't like something that came up a whole lot in my particular context. And if you work, again, if I were to have done research near a base, that would have been a really key, like sort of theoretical framework. So it's kind of too bad, but like at the same time, I don't know how many institutions, like race is like a really key context. People did, and I do talk about the ways that foster parents understand race, because a lot of foster parents don't want identifiable differences, like visually identifiable differences in their families. So one person said to me, I'm not racist, but, which is always a great way to start a sentence, right? I'm not racist, but I wouldn't want a child who's not Japanese in my family because they're visibly different. I want to pass, right, as a non, out of the normal family. So, you know, so people are definitely thinking about it, and it's more the folks who are sort of professionalized caregivers who are happy to have kids with disabilities or kids who don't look Japanese, whatever, in their families. So yeah, I do wish that I had sort of a broader base for theorizing that, but it didn't come up so much in my fieldwork.
Hi, thank you so much for your presentation. I have two questions. One is, I'm curious how the emergence of kodomocho is going to impact and influence sort of, right? It's supposed to be the place to think about kids across Japan, not just kids with biological families, but kids in institutional care, various ways. So I'm curious if you've sort of encountered how that's sort of helped influence any of the rhetoric discourses around children who are not able to live with their biological parents for one reason or another. And my second question is, one of the things that when I think about the koseki and like responsibilities and rights is how in Japan most children are required to take care of their elderly parents, right? And that is, you could call it because or of the koseki, you know, it's forced onto people, or like thankfully we have the koseki so that can be done. But it also seems like the government's way of sort of displacing their own sort of state responsibility of care of its own people to be sort of individualized into these like sort of, right, family units. And especially for kids who are not growing up with their biological parents, they still have this connection through the koseki. And I've heard of cases where it comes up that they actually have to prove that they've been neglected and abandoned by their parents to be relinquished of the right to take care of their elderly parents financially, physically, in various ways. And I'm curious if those sort of long-term sort of aspects are even something that people who are engaged activists or civil servants or anyone who's sort of involved with children who are living in these facilities like think about and sort of discuss, and how does that sort of impact the way we think about foster care or institutionalized care of children.
Yeah. You've just provided like two awesome research questions that are very nicely connected. The kodomocho question I have no answer for. I haven't been back to Japan since 2019. So thank you, COVID. And I feel like totally insufficient in answering any question that I haven't talked to people in like real, do anthropologists feel this way often? Right? I know it's like I can read something, but I don't really know if it's true unless I actually talk to a bunch of people. So I don't know the answer to that question. I think it's a really important one, and it'll be really interesting to see. The question about elder care, I mean, everything you said is true to my own research experience in terms of people telling stories about, somebody knocking on their doors saying your mom applied for welfare, and the person's like, who's my mom? Like the person in the koseki that I've never met. And so I didn't hear activists addressing this actually, and it's kind of interesting actually when you ask that question. I've just more heard people themselves saying like this really was disturbing and jarring to have this outreach from the welfare office or something like. I've never heard of somebody having to prove, I mean maybe it's sort of evident and easy to say, well I mean like look, I was raised in an institution, I don't even know this person. So I don't know if activists are addressing it. It seems like it should be important, but you're totally right. I mean, I think it is a displacement of responsibility, and it's this kind of, it's a really horrific experience to have, I'm sure, for people to get that type of like, knock, 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 like, pay for your mom's rent, please. So sorry for not having like better answers, but I think those are actually really interesting questions to look into further.
Yeah, go for it. There's no questions on online yet, so please go for it.
Please, no.
So thank you so much. I don't think I said that before. I'm sorry. I love your work, and I teach your work all the time. It's great. And I certainly know, I don't know if anybody in this room right now is taking classes where I've assigned your work, but people really react, right? Especially to the story about teeth and just like this.
Yeah, and Professor
expression.
Alexi knows my work better than
Well, no, I don't. No, it's an incredible moment. I mean, it's so real and so believable and so powerful as like this instantiation of everything it's the way you frame it, let's be clear. One of the things that I find myself thinking about is it seems like in every culture, certainly, this probably is the case, but in Japan there's some ways or some moments in some institutions where it feels like if we just ignore this problem that children are having or that's related to children, it will not be a problem for the children. So like the classic example in my research, right, is, okay, so your parents get divorced and the non-custodial parent just disappears, just evaporates. And the logic there is that it's better for the child not to have to shuffle between homes, not to have to negotiate those relationships. And just to be clear, I do see that logic. I really do see that logic because it does take a lot of energy and logistics and all of that stuff to keep that together. But I was thinking here too that this is a question like, do you see any of that in your work as well? That it does sort of feel like, well, if we don't remind the children, do you know what I mean? Like if they don't know what they're missing,
right.
or if we don't talk about their lack of family, it'll be okay. And I'm not trying to simplify it, but it feels like a kind of, I don't know if hope, like a model based entirely on just like hoping if we don't talk about it, this won't be a problem. That's what I'm trying to get to.
Kind of
This kind of delusional optimism. Like we just don't talk about it, it's not going to be a problem. And maybe there's some times when that is the case, but I sort of keep finding myself returning to that, and not in a spiteful, nasty way, but like really, truly people trying to solve problems for children, but just like never talking about it.
Yeah.
And here's the connection. I wonder if that has anything, I know your next project about air is probably a different kind of air, right? But like,
I know it's funny because Emma's next talk is kooky also, right?
Exactly. Yeah. So we've got this like little air moment going on.
Yeah, right.
But I was thinking, yeah, that's all well and good, but there's also all this discourse about read the air and like, you can get things. There's a lot of discourse in Japan about understanding things that are not verbalized, right? So I was just wondering, I'd love to get your thoughts or hear any reactions if any of that rings true for you.
Oh, yeah. No, of course it does. Yeah, thank you. I mean, it's always fun talking to you about these things because, like, no, I think we're on the same page about all of these topics. But, it's interesting. So the woman that I was quoting recently who said, like, yamete hoshi, she doesn't want to have people talking about reunification or foster care. I met her when there was a group of youth from child welfare systems in Japan who came to Los Angeles for a study tour. And so that was under this Japanese, a Japan Foundation grant that I helped apply for. And so that group of youth shared their stories a lot, and we got to sort of hear about their diverse experiences. And in her case, that same woman, that institution, the kids were told not to talk about their pasts with each other. So, these are kids who are taken from their homes. Often they don't know why. They don't know when or if they would ever go back. They don't know what the context is, the legal context for their placement. And they're in an institution with all these other kids who are all there for the same sorts of reasons, and they're told not to talk about their pasts. And ostensibly, it was with caring intention, right? Like, you don't want to trigger your residents or whatever, right? And so it was this sort of notion of like politeness or care. But as a result, it became this like taboo topic, right? And so another example, like what you're talking about here, is that there's a kind of movement, one might say, to do life story work in Japan. So that's an international child welfare mechanism that is about producing documentation about a child's past. So ostensibly, this is because if you move between placements a lot, you lose a lot of stuff, right? So you don't have photos, you don't have like mementos, you don't have maybe even clothing that you grew up with. And so the idea is if you write it down, at least you have these facts that you can take with you, and you have this little book that you can carry with you. So in Japan, there's this kind of move to do life story work, and unsurprisingly, probably this is not going super well, and it's people don't know how to talk about kids' past with them. So it's, it's sort of, and even the people who do the most work on this sort of life story work initiative, like they tend to sort of advocate for sort of more like in passing, like if a child mentions something about their past, they say, well, you should like, follow up with the kid, right? Like ask them, oh, what was that like? Or, what do you remember about that? Or how was that for you? And what I saw is that this caregivers care about these kids, and they like freeze. If a kid mentions, like, so Eri-chan, this is an example that I talked about today, she told this caregiver that she had been thrown into the trash can, and she'd heard that from her grandmother, who said that she'd heard it from the mom, right? And the staff member didn't know what to say, so she didn't say anything. And it's whether or not that was empirical reality, whether or not that was something that anybody could find out whether it was true, like, one could imagine a world in which you say, wow, that must feel really bad to have heard that, at least, right? So I don't, I think there is a sort of like linguistic ideology about what people feel is sayable in certain contexts, and that, this sort of silence as a form of care is real. And unfortunately, I think it can be really harmful, right? And, so, yeah, like this idea of the non-custodial parent, like, oh, let's not try to complicate things by having this person in the child's life, right? But ultimately, that sort of linguistic ideology connects to a relational ideology about like what sorts of relationships are possible to imagine too. So, yeah, it's a really interesting question. Thank you. Keep them coming. No.
Yeah, we have 10 minutes left. We don't have any questions online, so does anyone else have? Oh, I couldn't see you over there.
Thank you so much. That was fascinating. I'm looking at your photo, and I kind of have a question related to that and a little bit to Dr. Alexi's point. I guess you mentioned that like Eri kind of was able to say, oh, I want to leave the system now. I'm curious how kids' opinions, maybe that's related to age a little bit too, but just sort of how that functions or doesn't function, if you could speak to that a little bit.
Yeah. Oh, it's such a depressing story. No. I mean, so this is mandated by law. Like, you have to have like a place for children to share their opinions. I mean, and reality. Who's going to read those? Like, just the staff members at the institution, right? So if somebody's like, this kid's abusing me or whatever, like, whether or not they deal with it is up to them. So yeah. So do kids' opinions get listened to? Hardly at all. And, and there isn't, in the United States at least, in many places, there's court-appointed special advocates that attend court with kids, and their entire job is to hear what their experience has been and like help make a decision that's really child-centered. And there isn't really a situation like that in Japan. So it's like a movement, though. At the same time, there's this like let's bend our ears to the child's voice, like let's hear what kids have to say. And in my experience, it's very performative. So there's this sort of these like panels, right? Like the panel is like a thing in Japan. This idea of speaking like taikendan, like your story of your life, and you tell your story in front of other people. And so one of my friends, one of the women who lived in the Osaka house of the sibling pairs that lived together, she did a lot of those sort of like events. And she one time described it as somewhere where the audience members could all cry in empathy and leave satisfied with their tears. Right, so, you know, and so she also was part of, she's done a lot of work with the Ministry of Health, Labor, and Welfare, and there is this sort of notion that they would have these like appointees that are youth with lived experience in child welfare who like will inform policy. And the group that came to LA that I participated in, we were talking a lot about what that looked like, and tokenism was a word that was used a lot. Like, so, you know, people don't feel comfortable speaking. And I think this is also maybe this is linguistic ideology too, but in Japan, people tend to feel comfortable speaking from their own experience, right? But generalizing that out to say, you know, this is what I think should be done is a hard thing to do under any circumstance. And, you know, and so in the end, I think what happens a lot is like there's like 3 youth on a panel that the Ministry of Health, Labor, and Welfare is running, and they give their experiences and they say, you know, it would have been better for me to be with my biological parents or whatever. And they're like, okay, well, we've listened to your opinion, you know. So it's just really hard, I think, in Japan right now to feel like, you know, like there is anywhere that those stories go that actually make a difference. So the group that brought the youth to LA is called IFCA, the International Foster Care Alliance. And they have done a lot of work in the United States with policy making for kids in child welfare. And they're trying to actually bring a model of having a youth commission, which is something that exists in LA. So Los Angeles County has the biggest population in child welfare of the entire United States. It's like the entire size of Japan's child welfare population. It's like, yeah, it's insanely huge. It's like 40,000 kids. And so the idea would be that this can work in the United States to have like a youth commission where there actually is policy that can come out of opinions. But we'll see what happens. I mean, it's a pretty exciting sort of thing because this organization has good connections and some good energy about doing this, but whether or not it's going to be feasible in Japan, we don't have like an ombuds situation in Japan where you have like a youth ombuds person or something, right? Like it's just structurally, it's a really different system. So there is sort of movement about it, but as often in Japan, these things are kind of coming from the United States, right? Coming from the West as like a possible way of doing things, and whether or not that's, you know, culturally appropriate or even, you know, systematically possible is a kind of open question. But people are talking about it at least, so yeah, great question.
We have time maybe for one last quick question, if anyone has anything else they want to ask.
You all satisfied with your tears? No, just kidding.
Well, in that case, I'd like to close out the session and say thank you very much to Kate Goldfarb for a really fascinating, albeit at times pretty harrowing talk. But thank you so much for coming, and yeah, have a great rest of the day.
Hey, thank you so much for being here, and thank you for inviting me.